in this lesson, we'll take a look at how we can use our color texture that we just created to create a bump map as well. So let's go ahead and jump back in here. So we've got our color texture created. Let's go ahead and go back up to the texture tab. And I'm going to go ahead and save out a copy. So I'm going to save texture as a copy with this selected. And let's go ahead and save it as the default TIFF format. And then in our project files, we'll go ahead and go into images, and let's just save this. And I'm just going to call this something like bump copy. And let's go ahead and save it. Okay, so we still have our material 1 here. Let's go ahead and open up that bump copy that we created. Okay, so now we have bump copy selected. It's got all of the same layers. So the idea now is that I want to use the detail that we have in here to actually create a bump, with the idea that in a bump map, the light values are going to be sort of raised up, but the darker values are going to be lowered down. And so you're going to have this illusion of a bumpy detail that I want to be able to match with the color texture that we have. So we need to decide what matches that sort of paradigm of light equals raised and dark equals lowered. So in this case, we have these dark scales which we actually want to be raised up. So it doesn't make sense for the dark scales in a bump map. We want them to be actually lighter scales. And so we can actually take those small scales, and I'll take that layer, and we can actually just get rid of it by clicking on the delete layers button here. And I'm going to take the ambient occlusion, and I want to dial this down a little bit. Okay. We can also go ahead and convert this texture into black and white because we don't really need any of the color values. So we can do that by just going into our image and converting that into grayscale. It's going to give us a little warning, but now we've got all of that converted. Now the neck right now is really, really light, okay, which is not necessarily what we want, that neck to be raised out like that. So we can take the neck and start to just use our color correction. We can take our levels, let's say, and you can see the default value, or the value that we left it at, gives us that sort of a look. Okay, and so I think something closer to that is probably what we want. So we still get the detail in there, but it's not all super bright so that it's all sort of being raised up. Okay, so you still get all this detail, for instance, from the skin, the bumpiness of the skin. Okay, you get some of that detail from the striations on the abdomen. Okay, I'm going to take the ambient occlusion. Let's dial that down even just a little bit more. Just because we're getting a lot of these dark lines between the scales, it's going to try to push those in. I don't necessarily want all of that to happen. All right, so once we've got that the way that we want it, we can go ahead and we can flatten everything down. And then we can either just select everything, or we can just go to select all. And now let's go ahead and copy that. We'll go into our material 1 bump, which is our original bump map, and let's paste it in there. And now you can see that there's a couple of layers, the background layer and then the layer that we just pasted. Okay, so let's go ahead and flatten that down. So now that bump is associated with the actual bump in our material. Okay, so it's actually going to be driving the bump. And if we look in our material and go to our standard and look in our material, which is this one, we go into our bump. That's the texture that's actually associated with the bump. So it now contains that information, and we'll be able to see the result of the bump and the color and everything once we put everything back together. Okay, so let's jump back into our 3D paint. So the bump is going to describe how the bumpiness happens over the surface of the model, but we also want to maybe describe how the specularity happens across the model. So maybe the neck is really wet and it's very specular and it has a tight specular highlight. Maybe the same thing with some of the soft tissue, but maybe some of the hard tissue like the abdomen or the shells on the back, or maybe these scales up here, maybe they're not so specular. Maybe they're not quite as glossy or shiny. So we can actually define that using a specular map. So in the next lesson, we'll actually go ahead and probably just go from scratch to paint our specular map so that we can define how that specularity happens across the model, just so it's not the same across a model that ostensibly is made up of a lot of different types of materials. Okay, so we'll go ahead and take a look at creating a specular map in the next lesson.